The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Clarence House as King Charles III stood at his study window, watching the early gardeners tend to the roses that Camilla loved so dearly. His weathered hands gripped the window frame as he contemplated the decision that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. Charles had always understood that becoming king would require sacrifices, but he had never anticipated that one of the most painful decisions of his reign would involve the woman he loved most in the world. The irony wasn't lost on him that after decades of fighting for the right to marry Camilla, he now found himself in a position where protecting the monarchy might mean distancing himself from her family. The trouble had begun 6 months earlier when Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, had made what many considered an ill-advised business deal. As a food critic and author, Tom had built a respectable career on his own merits, carefully avoiding trading on his connection to the royal family. However, his latest venture had crossed lines that the palace's advisors deemed unacceptable for someone so closely connected to the crown. Tom had entered into a partnership with a luxury food company that had questionable financial backing. Intelligence reports suggested that some of the investors had connections to offshore accounts that couldn't be properly verified. While Tom himself was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, the mere association posed a potential scandal that could reflect poorly on the royal family during Charles's still new reign. The situation became more complicated when Camilla's daughter, Laura Lopez, was photographed at several high-profile social events with individuals who had been flagged by the security services. Laura, an art curator, had been attending gallery openings and cultural events as part of her professional duties. She had no idea that some of the wealthy art collectors she was networking with were under investigation for money laundering through art purchases. Charles had initially tried to handle the situation quietly, hoping that his private conversations with Camilla would be sufficient to address the concerns. He had suggested that perhaps Tom might reconsider his business partnerships, and that Laura might be more selective about her professional associations. But Camilla, protective of her children as any mother would be, had bristled at the suggestion that they were doing anything wrong. The tension in their private quarters had become palpable. Camilla, who had weathered decades of public scrutiny and criticism to stand by Charles's side, felt that he was now asking her to choose between her children and her royal duties. She couldn't understand why, after all they had endured together, he would question her family's integrity. The breaking point came during a heated discussion in the Queen's private sitting room at Buckingham Palace. Camilla had accused Charles of becoming too much like his mother, prioritizing the institution over personal relationships. The comparison to Queen Elizabeth II stung deeply, not because Charles didn't respect his mother's dedication, but because he had always promised Camilla that their marriage would be different from the cold, duty-bound relationships that had characterized previous royal marriages. Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, had been the one to present the king with the security briefing that would change everything. The document, marked with the highest classification levels, detailed concerns that went far beyond Tom's business dealings and Laura's social connections. Intelligence services had identified a pattern of approaches to Camilla's family members that suggested a coordinated effort to gain influence within the royal circle. The briefing revealed that several individuals who had recently entered the orbit of Camilla's children appeared to be working together, despite having no obvious connections to each other. Phone intercepts and financial surveillance had uncovered a network that seemed designed to exploit any access they might gain to royal information or influence. The security services couldn't definitively prove malicious intent, but the pattern was concerning enough to warrant serious action. Charles found himself facing the kind of decision that had plagued monarchs for centuries: how to balance personal happiness with the security and stability of the realm. The advisors were unanimous in their recommendation that Camilla's family members should be temporarily excluded from official royal functions, and that their movements should be more closely monitored until the security concerns could be fully investigated and resolved. The king spent hours walking the grounds of Sandringham, trying to find a way to protect both his family and his kingdom. He thought about his grandfather, George VI, who had never wanted to be king but had accepted the burden when duty called. He remembered his mother's decades of service, putting the crown before personal desires time and again. Yet he also thought about his long struggle to marry Camilla and his promises that their love would not be sacrificed on the altar of royal protocol. The decision, when it finally came, was delivered in the form of a private memorandum that would never see public light, but would reshape the dynamics of the royal family forever. Charles had decided that until the security investigation was complete, Camilla's children and their families would not attend official state functions, would not receive royal protection, and would not have access to sensitive royal residences. The conversation with Camilla was the most difficult of Charles's life. He had waited until they were completely alone at Highgrove, their beloved country retreat, before telling her about the decision. The queen consort's reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by tears, and, finally, a quiet dignity that reminded Charles why he had fallen in love with her decades earlier. Camilla didn't argue or plead. She simply asked whether Charles trusted her judgment about her own children. When he couldn't give her the unequivocal answer she wanted, she nodded slowly and said she understood that he had to put the crown first. But the pain in her eyes told a different story, and Charles knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The practical implications of the decision began immediately. Tom Parker Bowles was quietly asked to postpone a cookbook launch that was to have been held at a royal residence. Laura Lopez found that invitations to royal events that she had previously received as a matter of course simply stopped coming. Camilla's grandchildren, who had delighted in their occasional visits to see Grandpa Charles, were no longer welcome at royal residences. The palace's press office had to carefully navigate questions about the absence of Camilla's family from recent events. They issued statements about scheduling conflicts and personal commitments, but royal watchers began to notice the pattern. Speculation started quietly in the press, with royal correspondents wondering whether there had been some sort of family falling out. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with renewed intensity, as if constant activity could distract him from the emotional turmoil at home. He increased his schedule of public engagements, spent more time reviewing government papers, and took on additional patronages. His staff noticed that he seemed more formal, more distant, as if he was retreating into the protective shell of kingship. Camilla, for her part, maintained her public duties with characteristic grace. She continued to attend official engagements, cutting ribbons, meeting with charity representatives, and supporting the causes she had championed for years. But those who knew her well could see the strain. Her smile seemed more forced, her laughter less spontaneous. The easy warmth that had made her popular with the public appeared to be dimming. The security investigation continued in the background, with intelligence officers conducting discreet inquiries into the various individuals who had raised concerns. They interviewed business associates, reviewed financial records, and monitored communications. The process was thorough but necessarily slow, as any rushed investigation might alert potential bad actors to the fact that they were being watched. Meanwhile, the emotional distance between Charles and Camilla grew wider. They still shared meals and attended official functions together, but the easy intimacy that had characterized their relationship seemed to have evaporated. Charles found himself second-guessing every decision, wondering whether he was becoming the kind of monarch he had never wanted to be. Camilla struggled with feeling like she was once again an outsider in the royal family, despite her official title and position. The isolation was particularly hard on Camilla's children, who suddenly found themselves cut off from a world they had never fully been part of but had grown comfortable visiting. Tom had to explain to his own children why they couldn't visit the royal residences anymore. Laura had to cancel professional commitments that had involved royal venues. Both siblings were hurt and confused by the sudden change in their circumstances. The first cracks in the palace's careful narrative management appeared when a photographer captured Camilla leaving her children's homes with tears in her eyes. The images, published in several tabloids, showed the queen consort in an unguarded moment of obvious distress. The headlines speculated about everything from health problems to marital difficulties, but none came close to the truth. Charles's brothers, Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, found themselves in the unusual position of trying to mediate between the king and queen consort. Both had their own complicated relationships with royal protocol and security concerns, but they could see the toll that the situation was taking on Charles. Edward, in particular, tried to suggest alternative approaches that might address security concerns without completely excluding Camilla's family. The Princess Royal, Anne, characteristically direct in her approach, told Charles bluntly that he was making a mistake that could cost him his marriage. She pointed out that Camilla had proven her loyalty to the royal family repeatedly over the years, and that punishing her children for circumstances beyond their control was both unfair and potentially counterproductive. Anne's words carried particular weight because of her reputation for putting duty above sentiment in her own life. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to yield results that complicated the initial assumptions. Several of the individuals who had raised security concerns were indeed found to have questionable motivations and connections. However, the investigation also revealed that Tom and Laura had been essentially innocent victims of sophisticated approaches by people who were skilled at hiding their true intentions. The security services reported that the network they had identified was more extensive than initially believed, with tentacles reaching into various aspects of British high society. The approaches to Camilla's family appeared to be just one part of a broader effort to gain influence and access to sensitive information. The revelation that the royal family had been targeted as part of this larger operation provided some vindication for the security measures that had been implemented. However, the emotional damage had been done. Charles faced the realization that while his decision might have been justified from a security standpoint, the way he had implemented it had been unnecessarily harsh and had failed to account for the human cost to his family relationships. He began to understand that being an effective king required not just making tough decisions, but making them in ways that preserved the relationships and trust that were essential to the monarchy's long-term stability. The king started meeting privately with security officials to explore ways to address the ongoing concerns while beginning to rebuild the bridges with Camilla's family. He realized that excluding them entirely had not only caused personal pain, but had also potentially made them more vulnerable to exploitation by those who might seek to use their estrangement from the royal family against them. As Charles contemplated the road ahead, he understood that the decision to exclude Camilla's family had been a turning point in his reign. The question now was whether the damage could be repaired and whether the lessons learned from this crisis could make him a better king and husband. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever, but Charles was beginning to understand that true strength lay not in making decisions in isolation, but in finding ways to protect both the institution and the people he loved. The autumn leaves at Windsor Castle seemed to mirror the melancholy that had settled over the royal household as the security investigation entered its 6th month. King Charles found himself caught between conflicting reports from his intelligence advisors and the growing emotional toll that his decision was taking on everyone around him. The morning briefings that had once focused on matters of state now regularly included updates on the complex web of surveillance and investigation that surrounded his stepfamily. Tom Parker Bowles had begun to notice changes in his professional life that went beyond the canceled royal events. Restaurant owners who had once eagerly sought his reviews were now more cautious about their associations. Publishing opportunities that should have been straightforward were suddenly complicated by additional background checks and legal reviews. The ripple effects of his connection to the royal family, which had always been carefully managed, were now becoming obstacles rather than advantages. The most heartbreaking aspect of the situation for Tom was explaining to his own children why their visits to see Grandpa Charles had stopped. His teenage daughter, who had grown particularly close to the king during family gatherings, couldn't understand why she was suddenly unwelcome at places she had considered a second home. Tom found himself making excuses about busy schedules and royal duties, but his children weren't easily fooled. Laura Lopez faced different but equally challenging consequences in her career as an art curator. The gallery where she worked had begun receiving unusual inquiries about her employment and professional activities. While her colleagues remained supportive, the atmosphere had become strained. Several high-profile exhibitions that would have benefited from royal patronage were now off limits, limiting both her professional opportunities and the gallery's prestige projects. The security investigation had revealed information that painted an increasingly complex picture of the threats facing the royal family. Intelligence officers had identified at least 12 individuals who had made various attempts to get close to Camilla's children over the past 2 years. These weren't random social climbers seeking proximity to royalty, but people with specific agendas that remained frustratingly unclear to the investigators. One particularly concerning case involved a wealthy businessman who had befriended Tom through their shared interest in sustainable food production. This individual had gradually introduced Tom to a network of investors and industry contacts, all of whom appeared legitimate on the surface. However, deeper investigation revealed financial connections to organizations with ties to foreign intelligence services. The businessman had been subtly gathering information about royal eating habits, schedule patterns, and security arrangements during casual conversations. Similarly, Laura had been approached by what appeared to be prestigious international art collectors interested in purchasing pieces for their private collections. These collectors had hosted elaborate parties and gallery openings, creating opportunities for Laura to network with wealthy and influential individuals. The security services had discovered that several of these collectors were using art purchases as a means of money laundering, and that information gathered from their social interactions with Laura had been passed on to unidentified third parties. The investigation had also uncovered attempts to exploit the emotional bonds within the family. Camilla's grandchildren had been approached at their schools by individuals posing as talent scouts, journalists, and even charitable workers. These contacts had been carefully designed to seem innocent while gathering information about family routines, residence security, and the children's relationships with their royal step-grandfather. As the scope of the threats became clearer, Charles began to understand that his initial response, while perhaps necessary, had been incomplete. Simply excluding Camilla's family from royal events had not eliminated their vulnerability. It had potentially made them more susceptible to exploitation by those who might use their isolation against them. The king realized that he needed a more sophisticated approach that could protect both the institution and the people he loved. The emotional strain on Camilla became increasingly evident to those around her. Palace staff noticed that she had begun spending more time alone in her private apartments, declining invitations to informal gatherings that she had previously enjoyed. Her lady-in-waiting observed that the queen consort had started avoiding phone calls from her children, unable to bear the pain in their voices when they asked about the ongoing situation. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had entered a phase that neither had experienced even during the darkest days of public opposition to their marriage. They maintained their official duties and public appearances with professional competence, but the warmth and partnership that had sustained them through decades of challenges seemed to have frozen. Palace staff began to notice small signs of the growing distance: separate breakfast arrangements, different departure times for shared events, and conversations that focused strictly on official business. Charles's own children, William and Harry, found themselves in the unusual position of being concerned about their father's marriage while dealing with their own complex relationships with Camilla. William, who had grown to respect Camilla's dedication to their father and her grace under pressure, quietly expressed concern to Charles about the long-term implications of the current approach. He pointed out that maintaining family unity had always been one of their mother Diana's wishes, and that creating divisions within the family could ultimately weaken rather than strengthen the monarchy. The investigation took an unexpected turn when security services identified a connection between the network targeting Camilla's family and a larger operation that had been attempting to infiltrate various aspects of British society. Foreign intelligence services had apparently developed a long-term strategy of cultivating relationships with individuals who had connections to influential British institutions, including not just the royal family but also government officials, military leaders, and business executives. This broader context provided both justification for the security measures and a framework for potentially resolving the situation. If Camilla's family had been targeted as part of a systematic effort rather than because of any failing on their part, then there might be ways to protect them without maintaining their complete isolation from royal activities. The challenge was developing security protocols that could mitigate the risks while allowing family relationships to function. The psychological impact on all family members was becoming increasingly apparent. Camilla's grandchildren, who had grown up with occasional visits to royal residences as a normal part of their lives, were struggling to understand why their family relationships had suddenly become complicated. Their parents had to navigate difficult conversations about security, privacy, and the unique pressures that came with their family's position. Tom and Laura both began to experience what security experts recognized as the long-term effects of being surveillance targets. They found themselves constantly second-guessing social interactions, wondering whether new acquaintances had ulterior motives. The spontaneous friendships and professional relationships that had been normal parts of their lives became sources of anxiety and suspicion. The media began to notice the absence of Camilla's family from royal events more systematically. Royal correspondents who covered official functions started asking pointed questions about why the queen consort's children and grandchildren were no longer visible at celebrations, state occasions, and informal royal gatherings. The palace's explanations about scheduling conflicts and personal commitments were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Several newspapers started investigating the situation independently, assigning reporters to track the movements and activities of Tom and Laura. While they hadn't uncovered the security concerns, their attention was making an already difficult situation more complicated. The increased media scrutiny was putting additional pressure on all family members and making it harder for security services to conduct their investigation discreetly. Charles found himself consulting with constitutional experts about the precedents for his situation. The monarchy had faced various security challenges throughout history, but the specific combination of family relationships and modern intelligence threats was largely unprecedented. Historical examples of royal family members being excluded from court activities usually involve political disloyalty or personal scandals, not external security threats. The king's advisors presented him with several options for moving forward. The most conservative approach would maintain the current restrictions until the security investigation was completely resolved, which could take months or even years. A moderate approach would gradually reintroduce family members to royal activities under enhanced security protocols. The most aggressive approach would restore normal family relationships while implementing comprehensive security measures to monitor and counter the identified threats. Each option carried significant risks and benefits. Maintaining the status quo protected the immediate security of royal activities, but threatened to permanently damage family relationships and potentially create new vulnerabilities. Gradually restoring access would require complex security arrangements and careful monitoring. Full restoration with enhanced protection would be expensive, resource-intensive, and potentially create security risks if the protective measures proved inadequate. The decision was complicated by the fact that the security threats were evolving. Intelligence services reported that the network they had identified was adapting to the increased scrutiny, changing methods, and potentially developing new approaches. Some of the individuals who had been under surveillance had disappeared from their usual locations, suggesting either that they had been warned of the investigation or that they had completed whatever mission had brought them to Britain. Charles began holding private meetings with each of Camilla's children to discuss the situation directly. These conversations were emotionally difficult, but necessary for understanding the full impact of his decisions. Tom spoke honestly about the professional and personal costs of the situation, while Laura described the strain on her children and the difficulty of maintaining normal family relationships under the current circumstances. Both children expressed understanding of the security concerns, while also making clear that they felt punished for circumstances beyond their control. They had cooperated fully with security reviews, provided access to their communications and financial records, and accepted restrictions on their activities. However, they also felt that they deserved to understand the specific nature of the threats and to participate in developing solutions rather than simply accepting isolation. The conversations with his stepchildren forced Charles to confront the reality that effective leadership required more than just making difficult decisions. It required communication, transparency, and collaborative problem-solving. His approach had been informed by his understanding of royal protocol and security requirements, but had not adequately considered the human elements that were essential to family relationships and long-term institutional stability. As winter approached, Charles realized that the anniversary of his coronation was only months away. The event would naturally involve extensive family participation and would be closely scrutinized by media and public. The current restrictions on Camilla's family would be impossible to explain or maintain during such a significant royal celebration. The approaching deadline forced him to accelerate his decision-making process and consider more creative approaches to balancing security and family unity. The king began working with his security advisors to develop a comprehensive plan that would address the identified threats while allowing family relationships to resume. This plan would involve enhanced background checking for all individuals entering royal social circles, improved communication protocols for sharing security concerns with family members, and regular briefings to help everyone understand and respond appropriately to potential threats. The emotional toll of the situation had also taught Charles important lessons about leadership and communication. He realized that protecting people often required trusting them with information rather than isolating them from it. His stepchildren had proven themselves capable of handling difficult situations responsibly, and their cooperation was likely to be more effective than their exclusion in addressing ongoing security concerns. The Christmas season at Sandringham had always been a time of family gathering and celebration for the royal family. But, as December approached, Charles found himself facing the prospect of the first Christmas of his reign without Camilla's children and grandchildren. The traditional family photograph, the informal gatherings, and the simple joy of watching children open presents in the morning would all be shadowed by the ongoing security restrictions that had driven a wedge through his family. Camilla had grown increasingly withdrawn as the holiday season approached. Palace staff noticed that she spent long hours walking alone through the gardens at Clarence's house, often returning with red eyes that suggested she had been crying. The woman who had once brought warmth and laughter to royal gatherings seemed to be disappearing into herself, replaced by a figure who performed her duties with mechanical precision but little joy. The security investigation had reached a crucial turning point when intelligence services finally identified the central figure behind the network that had been targeting the royal family. Alexander Volkov, a businessman with dual Russian and British citizenship, had been operating what appeared to be a sophisticated influence operation designed to gather intelligence on British institutions and potentially compromise individuals with access to sensitive information. Volkov's network had been more extensive than initially suspected, with tentacles reaching into various aspects of British society. The approaches to Tom and Laura had been just two elements in a broader campaign that had also targeted members of Parliament, senior civil servants, military officers, and business leaders. The operation appeared to be designed to create a web of compromised or influenced individuals who could provide intelligence or be manipulated to serve foreign interests. The revelation that the royal family had been targeted as part of a state-sponsored intelligence operation rather than opportunistic criminal activity changed the nature of the security response. Charles found himself receiving briefings that read more like espionage novels than typical royal security reports. The threats were sophisticated, well-funded, and apparently had been years in the making. Intelligence officers explained that Volkov's approach had been particularly clever because it relied on seemingly innocent social and business connections rather than obvious attempts at espionage. By cultivating relationships with Tom through food industry contacts and Laura through art world connections, his network had been able to gather information and potentially create leverage without raising immediate suspicions. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that the network had been preparing for a long-term campaign of influence. Phone intercepts and recovered documents suggested that they had been developing detailed profiles of royal family members, their habits, relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. The goal appeared to be creating opportunities for blackmail, manipulation, or intelligence gathering that could be activated when needed. Tom Parker Bowles had been particularly shaken by the revelation that people he had considered friends and business associates had been systematically gathering information about his family relationships. The sustainable food investor who had seemed so genuinely interested in environmental causes had been recording their conversations and reporting details about royal eating habits, schedule patterns, and even health information that Tom had mentioned casually. Laura had discovered that several valuable artworks she had helped authenticate for private collectors had been purchased using funds that could be traced back to Volkov's network. The gallery owners and collectors she had trusted had been unknowingly participating in what amounted to a money laundering operation that used high-value art as a means of moving funds internationally while establishing social connections with target individuals. The emotional impact of learning that their professional and personal relationships had been manipulated was devastating for both of Camilla's children. They struggled with feelings of betrayal, violation, and self-doubt. Tom began questioning every business opportunity he had pursued, wondering whether his success had been genuine or the result of manipulation. Laura found herself unable to trust new professional contacts, unsure whether their interest in her expertise was legitimate or part of another intelligence operation. Charles realized that his initial response of excluding Camilla's family had been based on incomplete information and had potentially made them more vulnerable rather than safer. By isolating them from royal protection and support, he had inadvertently created conditions that could be exploited by those who might use their estrangement against them. The king understood that he needed to fundamentally reconsider his approach to the situation. The breakthrough in the investigation had also revealed the sophistication of modern intelligence threats facing the monarchy. Traditional security measures that focused on physical protection and background checks were inadequate for addressing networks that operated through seemingly legitimate business and social connections. Charles found himself learning about cybersecurity, financial surveillance, and psychological manipulation techniques that were far removed from the ceremonial aspects of kingship he had expected to focus on. Security advisors recommended a comprehensive review of how the royal family interacted with the outside world. This would involve enhanced vetting procedures for all business and social contacts, improve communication protocols for sharing security concerns, and regular briefings to help family members recognize and respond to potential manipulation attempts. The goal was to create a security framework that could protect against sophisticated threats while allowing normal family and professional relationships to continue. The psychological toll of the situation had affected not just Camilla and her children, but also Charles himself. The king found himself second-guessing every decision, wondering whether other family members might also be targets of similar operations. He began viewing social interactions through the lens of potential security threats, which made it difficult to maintain the genuine personal connections that were essential to effective royal engagement. Camilla's relationship with Charles had entered a phase that neither recognized from their decades together. They continued to share living spaces and official duties, but the easy intimacy and mutual support that had sustained them through previous challenges seemed to have evaporated. Conversations became formal exchanges of necessary information rather than the warm, personal discussions that had characterized their marriage. The Queen Consort had begun spending more time at Ray Mill House, her private residence in Wiltshire, claiming she needed solitude to catch up on personal correspondence and charitable work. Palace staff understood that these extended absences were really opportunities for Camilla to visit her children without creating security complications for official royal residences. However, these visits were now conducted under surveillance and with security escorts, adding an atmosphere of suspicion and formality to what should have been normal family interactions. Charles's siblings had grown increasingly concerned about the impact of the situation on the king's emotional well-being and decision-making ability. Princess, and characteristically direct, had told Charles that his handling of the situation was reminiscent of the worst aspects of royal protocol that had damaged previous generations. She pointed out that the monarchy's strength had always come from its ability to adapt and evolve, not from rigid adherence to security procedures that created more problems than they solved. Prince Edward, drawing on his own experience of balancing royal duties with family relationships, suggested that Charles was falling into the trap of believing that being king required him to sacrifice personal happiness for institutional protection. Edward argued that a king who was isolated from normal family relationships would ultimately be less effective as a leader because he would lose touch with the human experiences that made him relatable and trustworthy to the public. The investigation's findings about Volkov's network had implications that extended far beyond the royal family. Government officials were briefing Charles on broader national security concerns related to foreign influence operations targeting British institutions. The king found himself participating in discussions about counterintelligence strategy and international relations that were more complex and consequential than he had anticipated when accepting the crown. Intelligence services had arrested several individuals connected to Volkov's network, but the central figure himself had disappeared, apparently warned about the investigation by contacts within the British establishment who were themselves under suspicion. The operation had been rolled up, but not before demonstrating the vulnerability of British society to sophisticated influence campaigns that exploited social and business relationships. The arrests and ongoing investigation had created a media firestorm that the palace was struggling to manage. While the specific details of the royal family's involvement were being kept confidential, news of the broader intelligence operation was creating public concern about foreign influence and institutional security. Royal correspondents were beginning to piece together connections between the investigation and the absence of Camilla's family from recent royal events. Charles found himself consulting with constitutional experts about how to handle the situation publicly. The monarchy's traditional approach of maintaining dignified silence about personal matters was being challenged by the need to address legitimate public concerns about national security and royal family safety. The king was learning that modern leadership required more transparency and communication than previous generations of royalty had needed to provide. The approach of the Christmas season forced Charles to make immediate decisions about family gatherings. The traditional Sandringham Christmas would normally include extended family members and close friends, but the current security restrictions made planning these events complicated. The king realized that continuing to exclude Camilla's children would create obvious gaps in family celebrations that would be impossible to explain to other guests and staff. Security advisors presented Charles with a detailed plan for gradually reintegrating Camilla's family into royal activities. This would begin with private family gatherings under enhanced security protocols, followed by careful inclusion in selected official events as confidence in the security measures grew. The plan would require significant resources and careful coordination, but offered a pathway toward restoring normal family relationships while addressing legitimate security concerns. The proposal also included provisions for ongoing security education for all family members, regular briefings about potential threats, and improved communication channels for reporting suspicious contacts or approaches. Rather than relying on isolation for protection, the new approach would emphasize awareness, preparation, and proactive security measures. Charles realized that accepting this plan would require him to acknowledge that his initial response had been flawed and potentially harmful. The king would need to have difficult conversations with Camilla and her children, taking responsibility for the pain his decisions had caused while also explaining the genuine security concerns that had motivated his actions. The prospect of these conversations was daunting, but Charles understood that leadership required not just making tough decisions, but also acknowledging mistakes and working to repair relationships that had been damaged in the process. The king was beginning to understand that protecting the people he loved might require trusting them with difficult truths rather than trying to shield them from complexity and risk. As December progressed, Charles found himself preparing for what would either be a Christmas that began to heal his family's wounds or one that marked the permanent fracturing of relationships that had taken decades to build. The weight of this decision felt heavier than any constitutional crisis or political challenge he might face as king, because it was fundamentally about love, trust, and the human connections that gave meaning to his role as both a monarch and a family member. The morning of December 15th marked a turning point that Charles had both dreaded and hoped for during the long months of family separation. He had finally arranged to meet with Tom and Laura at Highgrove House, their first face-to-face conversation since the security restrictions had been implemented. The meeting had taken weeks to organize, with security protocols requiring extensive advance planning and multiple contingency arrangements. Charles arrived at Highgrove early, walking through the gardens that he and Camilla had lovingly designed together over the years. The winter landscape, stark and beautiful in its dormancy, seemed to mirror his own emotional state. He had spent sleepless nights preparing for this conversation, knowing that his words could either begin to heal the wounds his decisions had created or confirm that the damage was irreparable. Tom arrived first, looking older and more serious than Charles remembered. The easy smile and relaxed demeanor that had characterized their previous interactions had been replaced by a cautious formality that hurt more than any harsh words could have done. When Laura joined them, Charles could see the same wariness in her eyes, the protective distance that people develop when they've been hurt by someone they trusted. The conversation began awkwardly, with stilted exchanges about health and whether that felt foreign to people who had shared family holidays and informal dinners for years. Charles realized that he had lost more than just their presence at royal events. He had damaged relationships that had taken years to build and that had brought genuine joy and normalcy to his life. Tom was the first to address the elephant in the room, asking directly what they had done wrong and why they had been cut off from family activities without explanation. His voice remained respectful, but there was an undercurrent of hurt and confusion that made Charles's chest tighten with regret. Laura followed with questions about their children, wanting to know whether their grandchildren would ever again be welcome in their step-grandfather's life. Charles had prepared for this moment, but found that his carefully planned explanation seemed inadequate when faced with the reality of their pain. He began with an apology, acknowledging that his handling of the situation had been flawed and had caused unnecessary suffering. He took full responsibility for the way the security concerns had been managed, admitting that fear and incomplete information had led him to make decisions that had harmed people he cared about deeply. The king then shared the details of the investigation that he was authorized to discuss, explaining about Alexander Volkov's network and the sophisticated intelligence operation that had targeted multiple British institutions. He described how their professional and social contacts had been deliberately cultivated as part of a long-term influence campaign designed to gather intelligence and potentially create leverage against high-profile targets. Tom's reaction to learning about the food industry contacts who had been recording their conversations was one of shocked betrayal. He had genuinely believed that his business relationships were based on mutual respect and shared environmental values, never suspecting that his casual comments about family life and royal routines were being systematically collected and analyzed by foreign intelligence operatives. Laura was equally disturbed to discover that her art world connections had been part of a money laundering operation. The collectors and gallery owners she had worked with had seemed passionate and knowledgeable about art, making their true motives even more shocking. She struggled with the realization that her professional expertise had been exploited to legitimize financial transactions that supported intelligence activities. Both siblings expressed anger not just about being manipulated, but about being excluded from information that could have helped them protect themselves and their families. They pointed out that if they had understood the nature of the threats, they could have been valuable allies in identifying suspicious approaches and gathering intelligence about the people targeting them. Charles realized that his instinct to protect them through isolation had been fundamentally flawed. By keeping them ignorant of the threats they faced, he had made them more vulnerable and had missed opportunities to turn them into informed participants in their own security. The conversation forced him to confront his own assumptions about leadership and protection, recognizing that true security often required trust and collaboration rather than secrecy and control. The discussion shifted to the impact on their children, with both Tom and Laura describing the confusion and hurt their families had experienced. Camilla's grandchildren had gone from feeling special and included in royal life to feeling rejected and unwelcome, unable to understand why their family relationships had suddenly become complicated. The teenagers especially had struggled with the change, wondering whether they had done something wrong or whether their step-grandfather no longer cared about them. Charles felt the full weight of his decisions as he listened to descriptions of children who had cried themselves to sleep wondering why they couldn't visit anymore, and teenagers who had become defensive and angry about their family's royal connections. The king realized that his attempts to protect the monarchy's security had created emotional wounds that would take years to heal, even if trust could be restored. The conversation took a crucial turn when Tom asked whether Charles trusted Camilla's judgment about her own children. The question struck at the heart of the marital tensions that had developed over the past months. Charles realized that by questioning the security implications of Camilla's family relationships, he had inadvertently questioned her judgment and loyalty, creating doubt where there should have been absolute trust. Laura followed up by asking whether they would ever again be treated as family members rather than potential security threats. She wanted to know whether every future interaction would be filtered through security protocols, or whether there was a path back to the natural, loving relationships that had developed over the years of Charles and Camilla's marriage. These questions forced Charles to articulate something he had been struggling to understand himself: the difference between being cautious and being suspicious, between protecting people and isolating them, between institutional security and personal trust. He began to see that effective leadership required finding ways to address legitimate concerns without destroying the relationships that made life meaningful. Charles shared his plans for moving forward, describing the enhanced security protocols that would allow family relationships to resume while providing protection against future threats. He explained how regular briefings would help everyone recognize and respond appropriately to suspicious approaches, and how improved communication would ensure that security concerns were shared rather than handled in isolation. More importantly, he committed to rebuilding the trust that his handling of the situation had damaged. Charles acknowledged that he had allowed his fears about being an effective king to override his judgment about being a good stepfather and husband. He promised that future security decisions would involve consultation and collaboration rather than unilateral action that excluded the people most affected by those decisions. The conversation lasted for over 4 hours, with breaks for tea and walks in the garden as emotions ran high and difficult truths were shared. By the end, while trust had not been fully restored, a foundation for rebuilding had been established. Tom and Laura agreed to work with security advisors to develop protocols that would protect their families while allowing relationships to return to something approaching normal. The meeting concluded with plans for Christmas gatherings that would mark the beginning of the family's reunification. These would start small, with immediate family only, and gradually expand as confidence in the security arrangements grew. The children and grandchildren would be briefed age-appropriately about safety considerations, but would not be burdened with details that might frighten them or make them feel unwelcome. Charles left Highgrove with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The conversation had gone better than he had dared to hope, but he understood that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time, not just words of apology and explanation. The king realized that he had learned valuable lessons about leadership that would serve him well throughout his reign. The next crucial step would be repairing his relationship with Camilla. The queen consort had agreed to the meeting with her children, but Charles knew that his marriage had been damaged by his handling of the situation. Camilla had felt forced to choose between her husband and her children, and had experienced the isolation and suspicion that had characterized the worst periods of her relationship with the royal family. Charles planned a private dinner with Camilla for that evening, their first extended personal conversation in months. He intended to share everything that had been discussed with Tom and Laura, and to ask for her forgiveness for the pain his decisions had caused. More importantly, he wanted to discuss how they could work together to rebuild not just their family relationships, but their partnership as husband and wife. The king understood that the strength of the monarchy ultimately depended on the strength of the relationships that supported it. A royal family that was divided against itself could not effectively serve the nation or maintain public confidence. Charles had learned that protecting the institution required protecting the people who made it function, and that true security came from trust and collaboration rather than suspicion and isolation. As evening approached, Charles felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. The conversation with Tom and Laura had been difficult but necessary, and had laid the groundwork for healing. The upcoming discussion with Camilla would be even more crucial, as it would determine whether their marriage could recover from the strain of the past year. The king realized that he was facing the most important conversation of his personal life, one that would determine not just his happiness as a husband, but his effectiveness as a monarch. The crown had never felt heavier, but for the first time in months, Charles felt that he might be learning how to wear it without losing himself in the process. The candlelit dinner at Highgrove that evening carried the weight of a marriage hanging in the balance. Charles had arranged for complete privacy, with even the most trusted staff dismissed for the night. He and Camilla sat across from each other at the small table in their private dining room, the same space where they had shared countless intimate conversations throughout their years together. But tonight the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty and unspoken pain. Camilla looked beautiful but distant, her usual warmth replaced by a careful guardedness that Charles had not seen since the early days of their relationship, when public hostility had made her cautious about showing emotion. She listened quietly as Charles recounted his conversation with Tom and Laura, occasionally nodding but offering little response to his attempts to gauge her reaction. When Charles finished explaining the security situation and his plans for moving forward, Camilla was quiet for several long minutes. When she finally spoke, her words cut through his explanations with devastating clarity. She told him that while she understood the security concerns, what had hurt most was feeling that he didn't trust her judgment about her own children. After decades of proving her loyalty to him and to the royal family, she had been treated as if her love for her children made her a security risk. The queen consort described the months of isolation she had endured, watching her children struggle with confusion and rejection while being unable to explain or fix the situation. She talked about lying awake at night wondering whether Charles had always seen her family as outsiders who were tolerated rather than truly welcomed. The doubt that had crept into their relationship felt like poison, making her question everything she thought she knew about their partnership. Charles realized that his attempts to protect the monarchy had inadvertently recreated the very dynamics that had made royal relationships so painful for previous generations. He had fallen into the trap of seeing family connections as potential liabilities rather than sources of strength. His fear of making mistakes as a new king had led him to make decisions based on institutional concerns rather than human relationships. Camilla's pain was compounded by the realization that she had spent months being treated as a potential security threat by the very people who were supposed to protect her family. Security briefings that discussed her children as if they were suspects rather than victims had made her feel like an outsider in her own home. She described feeling like she was reliving the worst aspects of the years when public opinion had been turned against her. But this time the rejection was coming from within the royal family itself. The conversation became more emotional as Camilla described watching her grandchildren's confusion and hurt when their visits to royal residences suddenly stopped. She had been forced to make excuses to protect them from understanding that they were now considered unwelcome, while internally struggling with her own feelings of rejection and betrayal. The woman who had worked so hard to bring warmth and normalcy to royal family life felt that her efforts had been not just unappreciated, but seen as dangerous. Charles attempted to explain that his decisions had been motivated by love and concern for her safety, but Camilla pushed back against this interpretation. She pointed out that truly protective actions would have involved consulting with her about the threats her family faced, giving them information they needed to stay safe, and working together to develop solutions. Instead, his approach had isolated and excluded them, making them more vulnerable rather than more secure. The Queen Consort's most devastating observation was that Charles had begun to sound like the worst stereotypes of royal protocol that prioritized institutional preservation over human relationships. She reminded him of their many conversations over the years about the need for the monarchy to evolve and remain connected to real human experiences. His handling of the security situation had represented everything they had both criticized about the old ways of royal behavior. Charles found himself confronting truths about leadership that went far beyond royal protocol or security procedures. Camilla was forcing him to examine whether becoming king had changed him in ways that were ultimately destructive to the relationships and values he claimed to cherish. The crown was meant to enhance his ability to serve and protect others, not to create barriers between him and the people he loved most. The conversation reached its emotional peak when Camilla asked whether Charles could imagine how it felt to be married to someone who didn't trust her judgment about her own children's character and safety. She described feeling like she was being asked to choose between her role as queen consort and her identity as a mother and grandmother. The isolation from her family had not just been painful. It had made her question whether she could continue in a role that seemed to require her to abandon the people who had supported her long before she had any royal titles. This moment of potential loss forced Charles to confront what truly mattered to him. The possibility that he might lose Camilla because of his misguided attempts to protect the monarchy made him realize how completely he had lost perspective. A crown that cost him his marriage and family relationships would be meaningless, regardless of how secure it might be from external threats. Charles took responsibility not just for the specific decisions about security restrictions, but for the broader failure of communication and trust that had characterized his approach. He acknowledged that becoming king had triggered insecurities about being worthy of the role that had led him to overcompensate by making decisions that seemed strong but were actually weak because they damaged the relationships that should have been his greatest source of strength. The king committed to fundamental changes in how he approached both leadership and marriage. He promised that future decisions affecting their family would be made jointly, with full consultation and collaboration. More importantly, he committed to regular conversations about the pressures and challenges of royal life, ensuring that they remained partners in facing difficulties rather than allowing institutional concerns to drive wedges between them. Camilla's response was cautious but not dismissive. She acknowledged Charles's apologies and commitments, but made clear that rebuilding trust would require consistent actions over time. The queen consort had been hurt too deeply to simply accept promises, regardless of how sincere they seemed. She needed to see evidence that Charles truly understood the impact of his decisions and was capable of learning from his mistakes. The conversation gradually shifted from confronting past hurts to planning future healing. They discussed how to explain the situation to Camilla's grandchildren in ways that would help them understand they had never been unwelcome, just caught up in circumstances beyond anyone's control. They planned approaches for rebuilding relationships with Tom and Laura that would acknowledge the pain that had been caused while also strengthening family bonds for the future. Christmas planning became a symbol of their commitment to rebuilding. They decided to host a family gathering that would include not just immediate family, but also some of the extended family and friends who made their celebrations meaningful. The event would send a clear message about the importance of family relationships while also serving as an opportunity to implement new security protocols in a natural, unobtrusive way. The evening concluded with Charles and Camilla taking a walk through the gardens they had created together, talking about the lessons learned from this difficult period. They both recognized that the crisis had revealed weaknesses in their communication and decision-making processes that could have caused problems in other areas if left unaddressed. In some ways, confronting these issues early in Charles's reign might prevent more serious problems later. Charles realized that effective kingship would require him to remain connected to his humanity rather than allowing institutional concerns to overwhelm his personal relationships. The strength of the monarchy would ultimately depend on the strength of the family that supported it, and maintaining those relationships would require ongoing attention and care. Camilla found herself cautiously optimistic about their future, while also more aware of the ongoing challenges they would face. The role of queen consort would always involve balancing personal relationships with institutional requirements. But this crisis had taught her the importance of advocating for her family's needs rather than simply accepting whatever arrangements others deemed appropriate. The weeks leading up to Christmas became a period of careful rebuilding. Tom and Laura gradually resumed contact with Charles, beginning with phone calls and progressing to informal visits. Their children were slowly reintroduced to royal life through carefully planned activities that emphasized fun and family connection rather than formal protocol. Security arrangements were implemented transparently, with family members briefed on precautions and included in planning rather than simply subjected to restrictions they didn't understand. The approach emphasized awareness and cooperation rather than isolation and control, creating a model for handling future security concerns that might arise. The Christmas gathering at Sandringham became a celebration of both family reunion and lessons learned. The traditional family photograph showed genuine smiles and relaxed interactions that had been absent for months. Charles and Camilla stood together with evident warmth, surrounded by children and grandchildren who looked happy and secure. The crisis had tested their marriage and family relationships in ways that none of them had anticipated, but it had also demonstrated their fundamental strength and commitment to each other. Charles had learned that being an effective king required maintaining his connections to the people and relationships that kept him grounded in human reality. Camilla had discovered her own strength and the importance of advocating for her family's needs, even when doing so created tension with institutional requirements. The experience had made her more confident in her role and more determined to ensure that the monarchy remained connected to real human experiences. The security investigation concluded successfully, with several arrests and the disruption of a significant intelligence network. However, the most important victory had been learning to address such threats through cooperation and trust rather than suspicion and isolation. The royal family had emerged stronger and more unified, better prepared to face future challenges together. As the new year approached, Charles reflected on how much he had learned about leadership, marriage, and the delicate balance required to serve both institution and family. The crown felt lighter now, not because the responsibilities were less weighty, but because he was no longer carrying them alone. The strength that came from genuine partnership and family support made him more confident in his ability to be the king that Britain needed.